What is your biggest fear? Is it being watched from the tree while you sleep in your tent? Is it your car breaking down on a deserted snowy road with no cell service? Or is it the person sleeping right next to you, plotting your end? Tonight, we explore 7 distinct nightmares. 7 true stories from the American archives that defy logic and chill the bone. We have the Woodchipper murder. That changed forensics forever. We have the girl in the box. And we have the mysteries that simply have no answer. Close your eyes, listen to the rain, and just try to fall asleep. Let's begin. There's a specific kind of silence that you only find in the deep woods. It is not an empty silence. It is a heavy, living thing. It is the sound of moisture dripping from ancient hemlock trees. It is the snap of a twig under the weight of a deer, or perhaps the weight of a boot. For millions of Americans, the national parks are a sanctuary. They are the places we go to escape the noise of the cities, to disconnect, to find peace under a canopy of stars. We pitch our tents, we zip up the doors, and we drift off to sleep, believing that the only dangers outside are the elements or the wildlife. We believe that the isolation is our protection. But in the spring of 1996, in the rolling Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, that belief was shattered. 2 women experienced strong and in love with the wilderness, hiked into the mist of Shenandoah National Park and never hiked out. For 30 years, their story has haunted the Appalachian Trail. It became a ghost story whispered around campfires, a story of a monster hiding in the trees, a story of a perfect getaway turned into a nightmare. For 3 decades, the mountains kept their secret. The rain washed away the tracks, the snow covered the evidence, and silence reigned. But silence does not last forever. Science has finally caught up with the shadows. New DNA technology, revealed only months ago, has breathed life into a cold case that many thought would never be solved. The ghost of Shenandoah is no longer invisible. Tonight, let the sound of the rain wash over you. Curl up in the safety of your room. Close your eyes, and let us walk together into the woods of 1996 to uncover the truth of what happened at the Bridgewater camp. To understand the tragedy, we must first understand the light that was extinguished. Julie Ann Williams, known to her friends as Julie, and Lolly Winans were not amateur tourists. They were women of the woods. Julie was 24 years old. She had a gentle, radiant spirit. She was a geologist, someone who looked at the earth and saw its history, its structure, its beauty. She had a smile that could light up a room, and a curiosity that drove her to explore. Lolly was 26. She was a wilderness guide. She was the kind of person who could build a fire in a rainstorm, read a topographical map like a novel, and navigate the toughest terrains with a calm confidence. They had met at Woods Women, an organization in Minnesota dedicated to outdoor leadership for women. They shared a love for nature that was spiritual, profound, and fearless. In May of 1996, the world was preparing for the Summer Olympics in Atlanta. It was a simpler time, before smartphones and GPS trackers were in every pocket. Julie and Lolly planned a trip that was supposed to be the start of a summer of freedom. They packed their gear, grabbed their beloved golden retriever, Taj, and headed for Virginia. Shenandoah National Park is a jewel of the American East. It is a long, narrow park that rides the crest of the Blue Ridge Mountains. It is famous for Skyline Drive, a road that winds through the clouds, offering breathtaking views of the Shenandoah Valley below. But if you step off the pavement, if you walk just a few hundred yards into the trees, civilization vanishes. The terrain is rugged. Rocky outcrops jet out like bones from the earth. Waterfalls cascade into dark, mossy pools, and the Appalachian Trail, the famous footpath that runs from Georgia to Maine, cuts right through its heart. On May 19, 1996, Julie and Lolly entered the park. The weather was typical for spring in the mountains, unpredictable. Warm sun one moment, chilling mist the next. They were looking for solitude. They didn't want the crowded campgrounds with RVs and generators. They wanted the backcountry. They parked their car near the Skyland Lodge, a historic resort nestled at the highest point of the drive. They leashed Taj, hoisted their backpacks, and began to hike down towards White Oak Canyon. If you have ever hiked in Shenandoah, you know the smell. It is the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and blooming mountain laurel. They found a spot off the beaten path. It wasn't an official campsite, but a secluded clearing near a stream called Jerry's Run. It was beautiful, private, perfect. They set up their tent, a small, blue nylon shelter against the vastness of the forest. They probably cooked a simple meal, fed Taj, and watched the sun dip below the mountains, painting the sky in hues of purple and bruised orange. They had no way of knowing that they were being watched, or perhaps that they had been followed. May 20th passed, then May 21st, then May 22nd. In the real world, life went on. Lolly was due to start a summer job. Julie was expected to call her father, Tom Williams, who she was incredibly close with, but the phone at the Williams household remained silent. By May 24th, worry began to turn into panic. It wasn't like them to be out of touch. They were responsible. They knew the risks of the wild. Julie's father called the National Park Service, telling them his daughter was in the park and hadn't come home. The rangers began their search where all searches begin, the trailheads. In a park of 200,000 acres, the car is the anchor. They found it quickly. Lolly's car was parked exactly where they left it, near Skyland. It was locked, cold, covered in a fine layer of pollen and leaves. This was a bad sign. If they had been lost on a hike, the car would be there. If they had been injured, the car would be there. But usually, hikers leave a note or a plan. On May 31st, a ranger was patrolling the horse trails near the White Oak Canyon area. It is a quiet part of the park. The canopy is dense there, blocking out much of the midday sun. The ranger spotted a golden retriever wandering alone. It was Taj. The dog was unleashed. He was thin, thirsty, and skittish, but he wasn't barking. He was just waiting. A dog wandering alone in the backcountry is the first alarm bell of a tragedy. The rangers followed the dog's general area. They pushed through the mountain laurel, and then they saw the blue color of the tent. It was set up in a lovely spot, near the stream. It looked peaceful. The rain fly was on. The zippers were closed. The ranger called out, "Hello? National Park Service." There was no answer, just the sound of the stream. The ranger approached and unzipped the fly. What he found inside shattered the peace of Shenandoah forever. Julie and Lolly were inside their sleeping bags. They had been bound, their mouths had been gagged, and their throats had been cut. There was no struggle in the campsite, no overturned stove, no torn fabric. It had happened quietly, brutally, and efficiently. The killer had entered their sanctuary, controlled them, and ended their lives while the rest of the world slept. The FBI was called in immediately. Federal crimes on national park land fall under their jurisdiction. The scene was baffling. Usually, crimes in the wilderness fall into specific categories. Robbery? No. Their expensive hiking gear, their cameras, and their money were untouched. Sexual assault? The autopsy results were inconclusive and complex. but it didn't fit the pattern of a typical sexual predator attack. So, who was this monster? Profilers began to build a picture. This was someone comfortable in the woods. He didn't stumble upon them by accident. To find that campsite, you had to know where you were going, or you had to be stalking them. He brought materials with him, restraints. This suggested premeditation. He came hunting. The fact that Taj, the dog, was unharmed and found near the site suggested the dog might have been familiar with the attacker, or the attacker knew how to calm dogs. Or perhaps the dog was simply too terrified to intervene. For years, the investigation focused on a man named Darrell Rice. Rice was a local. He had a history of aggression towards women. A year after the murders, in 1997, he was arrested for attacking a female cyclist in the same park. He had run her off the road and tried to abduct her, screaming that he hated women. He seemed to fit the profile perfectly. A misogynist, a predator, someone who viewed women in the park as targets. In 2002, the Attorney General announced an indictment. They were going to charge Rice with capital murder. They labeled it a hate crime, theorizing he targeted Julie and Lolly because he suspected they were a lesbian couple. The families prepared for closure. The public prepared for justice. But then, the case fell apart. It fell apart because of the very thing that is now saving it, DNA. In 2004, forensic science was advancing. They tested a hair found on one of the hand restraints used on the victims. They tested it against Darrell Rice. It was not a match. The case against Rice was dismissed. He was still in prison for the other attack, but he was not the Shenandoah murderer. The case went cold. Ice cold. For 20 years, the file sat in a box in Virginia. The killer was still out there. Maybe he was a drifter who moved on to another state. Maybe he was a local who hiked those trails every weekend, smiling at rangers, hiding his dark secret. Fast forward to June 2024. The world has changed. We now have a tool that criminals in 1996 could never have imagined. Forensic genetic genealogy. This is the technology that caught the Golden State Killer. It works by taking unidentified DNA from a crime scene, even a tiny, degraded sample, and uploading it to public genealogy databases. Investigators build a massive family tree. They find a third cousin, then a second cousin, and they narrow the branches down until only one person remains. In a stunning announcement this past summer, the FBI Richmond Field Office revealed that they have successfully revisited the evidence from the Shenandoah murders using new touch DNA technology, which can pull a genetic profile from just a few skin cells left on a piece of tape or a zipper. They have generated a new suspect profile. They stated that they are closing in. They are no longer guessing. They are looking for a specific lineage. They are looking for a man whose DNA was inside that tent. While they haven't released the name yet to protect the ongoing operation, the tone of the announcement was different. It wasn't a plea for tips. It was a warning. The FBI is systematically interviewing men who fit this genetic profile. They are asking for DNA swabs to rule people out. The net is tightening. After 30 years of silence, the trees are finally talking. As you drift off to sleep tonight, listening to the rain against your window, think of the power of truth. Time is usually the enemy of justice. Memories fade. Witnesses die. Evidence degrades. But in this case, time has become an ally. Science has preserved the final whisper of the killer, locked in the helix of his own biology. Julie and Lolly went into the woods to find peace. Their lives were stolen in a moment of violence, but their legacy was not lost. They are remembered not just as victims, but as pioneers, as nature lovers, and as women who lived life on their own terms. The Shenandoah is quiet tonight. The mist is rolling over White Oak Canyon. The stream at Jerry's Run is flowing over the rocks, just as it did in 1996. But the monster who walks those woods can no longer hide in the shadows. The light is coming, and soon, very soon, the silence will be broken by the sound of handcuffs clicking shut. High in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California, there's a darkness that feels older than the trees themselves. It is a place of immense beauty, where the pine forests stretch out like an endless green ocean and the peaks touch the clouds. In the summer, it is a paradise of hiking trails and crystal-clear lakes. But in the winter, the Sierras change. The snow falls so heavy and so fast that it can erase a road in an hour. The temperature drops until the air itself feels like it might shatter. And the silence becomes absolute. It is a silence that swallows sound, swallows light, and sometimes swallows people. Tonight, we are going to drive up a winding mountain road, away from the safety of the valley, away from the logic of the world we understand, and into that white, freezing void. We're going to look at a case that has baffled the FBI, local law enforcement, and armchair detectives for nearly 50 years. It is a story not of violence, but of confusion. A story of 5 gentle souls who drove into the night and simply vanished. This is the mystery of the Yuba County Five. To understand the darkness of that night, we must first understand the light of the men involved. They were not risk-takers. They were not outdoorsmen looking for danger. They were 5 best friends from Yuba City, a quiet agricultural town in Northern California. There was Gary Mathias, Jack Hewitt, Bill Sterling, Ted Wyer, and Jack Madruga. They ranged in age from 24 to 32. They were affectionately known by their families as the Boys. They were a tight-knit group, bonded by their shared challenges and their simple joys. They all lived with their parents or loved ones. They all dealt with mild intellectual disabilities or mental health conditions, which bound them together in a world that didn't always understand them. But within their circle, there was loyalty, there was laughter, and above all, there was a love for basketball. Their favorite team was the UC Davis Aggies. On the evening of February 24th, 1978, the 5 friends piled into Jack Madruga's prized possession, a turquoise and white 1969 Mercury Montego. It was a classic American car, heavy steel, spacious bench seats, a car that Madruga kept in pristine condition. He was proud of that car. He wouldn't let anyone else drive it. He knew every hum of its engine. They drove 50 miles south to Chico to watch a college basketball game. The mood in the car was electric. They were excited. Their own basketball team, the Gateway Gators, was scheduled to play in a tournament the very next day. They had their uniforms laid out on their beds at home. Winners of the tournament would get a free week at a camp in Los Angeles. For the boys, this was the Super Bowl. They wouldn't do anything to jeopardize that game. They wouldn't run away. They wouldn't take risks. They just wanted to watch basketball, eat some snacks, and get home to rest. The game in Chico was a success. The Aggies won. The boys were in high spirits. After the final buzzer, they stopped at a local market in downtown Chico. It was a mundane, comforting scene. They bought Hostess fruit pies, cherry and lemon. They bought a Langendorf lemon pie. They bought Snickers bars and Marathon bars. Just 5 friends, stocking up on sugar for the drive home. It was roughly 10 p.m. when they got back into the Mercury Montego. The drive from Chico back to Yuba City is a straight shot south down Highway 99. It is a flat, easy valley road. It takes about 45 minutes. They should have been home by 11 p.m. Their parents were waiting up. The uniforms were waiting. The beds were turned down. But the Mercury Montego never arrived in Yuba City. Instead of turning south towards the lights of home, the car turned east. This is the moment where logic ends and the nightmare begins. Why did Jack Madruga, a careful driver who knew the roads, turn his car towards the mountains? Why did they leave the valley floor and begin the long, winding climb up the Oroville-Quincy Highway? This wasn't a small wrong turn. This was a commitment. They drove past the last gas stations, past the last houses, and into the teeth of a brewing winter storm. They climbed higher and higher. The rain turned to sleet, and the sleet turned to heavy, blinding snow. The paved road ended, turning into a rough, gravel logging track. The Mercury Montego was a low-riding sedan, not built for this terrain. Its tires would have been slipping on the rocks and ice. The suspension would have been groaning, and yet they kept driving. They drove nearly 50 miles off course, deep into the Plumas National Forest, a wilderness so vast and rugged that even experienced rangers hesitate to enter it in winter. Eventually, the car could go no further. At an elevation of 4,400 feet, on a desolate snow-covered track, the tires lost traction. The car became stuck in a snowdrift. It wasn't buried. It wasn't crashed. It was just stuck. When the parents of the boys woke up the next morning, the silence in the houses was deafening. The beds were empty. The uniforms were untouched. Panic set in immediately. This was completely out of character. Police were called. Search parties were organized. But the storm that had trapped the boys was now trapping the searchers. A massive blizzard slammed into the Sierras, dumping feet of snow and grounding all helicopters. It took 4 days to find the car. A park ranger, navigating the treacherous road in a snowcat, spotted the turquoise shape of the Mercury Montego against the endless white. The discovery of the car raised more questions than it answered. It was immaculate. The gas tank was a quarter full. The keys were gone, but the car was unlocked. When police hot-wired it, the engine started immediately. 5 strong men could have easily pushed the car out of the small snowdrift it was stuck in. And if they couldn't push it, why didn't they sit inside? The heater worked. They had gas. They had warm clothes. They had food. The wrappers of the fruit pies and candy bars were found in the car, along with the program from the basketball game. But the car was empty, and the snow around it offered no clues. The storm had wiped the slate clean. No footprints, no direction, just a pristine car sitting alone in the middle of a frozen hell, with the window rolled down a few inches, letting the snow drift onto the back seat. The search for the men was one of the largest in California history, but the mountain refused to give them up. Weeks turned into months. The snow kept falling, burying whatever secrets lay in the forest. The families waited in agony, suspended between hope and grief. Was it a kidnapping? Did they see something they shouldn't have? Did they run away? None of it made sense. Then the snow began to melt. In June, 4 months after the disappearance, a group of motorcyclists was riding through a remote area of the forest, about 19 miles away from where the car had been found. They came across an abandoned Forest Service trailer. It was a small, rusted shelter used by rangers in the summer. Inside the trailer, they found a scene of heartbreak that defies description. Lying on a bed, wrapped in 8 sheets, was the body of Ted Wire. Ted was the gentle giant of the group. He had feet that were badly frostbitten, but it wasn't the cold that had killed him. It was starvation. He had lost nearly half his body weight. And this is the detail that haunts everyone who hears this story. Ted had lived in that trailer for anywhere from 8 to 13 weeks after the disappearance. He had been alive while the helicopters were flying overhead. He had been alive while his mother was weeping on the news. But the tragedy is deeper. The trailer was not empty. It was stocked with food. There were cans of sea rations, dried meals, and a locker full of provisions. There was a propane tank outside that could have provided heat and hot water. There were matches. There was heavy clothing. Ted had eaten some of the cans, opening them with an Army P-38 can opener. But he stopped. He didn't touch the locker. He didn't turn on the gas. He lay in the cold, slowly fading away, surrounded by everything he needed to survive. It was as if he was waiting for permission, as if he was afraid to break the rules of the cabin. Or perhaps he was too weak, too frightened, or too confused to understand that the food was there for him. As the snow continued to recede, the mountain slowly revealed the rest of the tragedy. The remains of Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling were found about 11 miles from the car, halfway to the trailer. They were just bones, scattered by the wildlife. It appeared they had sat down in the snow to rest and simply fell asleep, succumbing to hypothermia in the deep peace of the freeze. Jack Hewitt's remains were found by his own father, who had never stopped searching. He found his son's backbone and shoes under a manzanita bush, just a few miles from the trailer. Only Gary Mathias was never found. His tennis shoes were inside the trailer, suggesting he had made it there with Ted, but his fate remains written only in the wind. Did he try to walk for help? Did he wander into the deep ravine? Gary is still out there, somewhere in the vast, green ocean of the Plumas Forest. The autopsy results and the location of the bodies allowed investigators to piece together a terrifying journey. After leaving the car, instead of walking back down the road toward civilization, a walk that would have been downhill and led to a lodge just a few miles away. They walked up the mountain. They walked into the darkness, deeper into the wilderness, wearing only light jackets and dress shoes. They walked 19 miles through 5-foot snowdrifts in pitch blackness with no flashlights. It is a physical feat that seems impossible. It would have required superhuman endurance. Why? What were they running from? Or what were they walking toward? There is one final piece to this puzzle, a piece that adds a layer of supernatural dread to the story. On the night the boys disappeared, a man named Joseph Shines was driving up that same mountain road. He was a local, checking the snow line for a ski trip. Around the time the boys would have been on the mountain, Shines's car got stuck. While trying to push it out, he suffered a massive heart attack. He lay in his car in agonizing pain, drifting in and out of consciousness for hours in the freezing night. He told police that in the middle of the night, he saw lights. He saw a car pull up behind him. He saw headlights. He also claimed he saw a group of men standing on the road, illuminated by the beams. He called out to them, "Help me. I'm hurt." He said the lights immediately went out. The men stopped talking. They vanished into the silence. Later, he saw flashlights moving in the trees. He whistled. He honked his horn. But the lights never came closer. They seemed to float away, like will-o'-the-wisps, deeper into the forest. Was this the Mercury Montego? Were these the boys? Did they see Joseph Shines and panic? In their state of mind, did they think he was a threat? Or did Shines, in the delirium of a heart attack, hallucinate the whole thing? If he did see them, it means they were there. They were alive. They had a working car. And yet, they chose to abandon it and walk into the abyss. There are theories, of course. Some say Gary Mathias, who had schizophrenia and had gone without his medication, might have had an episode and led the others astray. But Gary was the one with the most outdoor experience. He knew how to survive. Would he really lead his friends 19 miles in the wrong direction? Others say they were chased, that someone ran them off the road, but there were no dent marks on the car, no other tire tracks found in the initial search. Some believe it was a simple, tragic cascade of errors. A wrong turn, a panic, a fear of getting in trouble for damaging the car, leading to a decision to walk to what they thought was a friend's house, only to get lost in the whiteout. But none of the theories explain the trailer. Why did Ted starve amidst plenty? Why didn't they start a fire? Why didn't they break a window to get in, instead of just finding the unlocked door? The psychology of the Yuba County Five is the true mystery. It is a mystery of the mind. How fear and confusion can transform a familiar world into a maze of terror. How 5 men, bound by friendship, stayed together until the very end, marching shoulder to shoulder into the freezing dark. Tonight, the Plumas National Forest is just as quiet as it was in 1978. The road is still there, winding up from Oroville, past the tree line, into the snow. The trailer is gone now, removed by the Forest Service, but the spot remains. If you stand there on a winter night, when the wind dies down, you can almost feel the weight of their journey. You can imagine the crunch of dress shoes on crusted snow, the heavy breathing of 5 men trying to survive, the confusion, the cold, and finally the sleep. The case remains officially closed, listed as accidental death. But for those who know the story, the door never really shuts. It hangs open, like the window of the Mercury Montego, letting the snow drift in, burying the answers forever. We are left only with the silence, the vast, indifferent silence of the mountains, which keeps its secrets and holds the boys in its cold embrace, frozen in time, forever young, forever together, on the road to nowhere. In the deep south of the United States, on the border where the sprawling pine forests of Florida meet the red clay of Georgia, there lies a body of water known as Lake Seminole. It is a place of immense, prehistoric beauty. 37,000 acres of dark, tea-colored water, choked with lily pads, sawgrass, and the hanging gray drapes of Spanish moss that sway in the humid breeze. Beneath the surface, the lake is a maze of submerged timber, the skeletal remains of trees that drowned when the valleys were flooded decades ago. It is a hunter's paradise, teeming with mallards and canvasbacks that flock there in the winter months. But it is also a place that keeps its secrets. The locals know that the water here is not just a landscape, it is a living thing. It has a heavy, suffocating presence, and it is home to creatures that have survived unchanged for millions of years, the American alligator. These ancient reptiles drift through the black water like logs, watching, waiting, and vanishing without a ripple. This is the setting for a story that haunted the quiet town of Tallahassee for nearly 2 decades. It is not a story of a random act of violence, but of a betrayal so intimate, so calculated, and so cold that it chills the blood even in the sweltering Florida heat. It is the story of a perfect marriage, a best friend, and a hunting trip from which only the boat returned. To understand the darkness that descended on December 16th, 2000, we must first look at the light that surrounded Jerry Michael Williams, known to everyone simply as Mike. Mike was the embodiment of the American dream. At 31 years old, he had everything a man could want. He was handsome, with a boyish charm and a work ethic that was legendary in his community. He was a real estate appraiser, a job that required attention to detail and long hours, and he was good at it. He was the kind of man who checked the locks twice, who planned for the future, who ensured his family was safe. Mike had married his high school sweetheart, Denise. They were the golden couple of North Florida. Denise was beautiful, poised, and polished. She worked at Florida State University and carried herself with an air of perfection. Together, they looked like a photograph from a magazine. They lived in a pristine, upscale subdivision. They attended church every Sunday. They had a beautiful infant daughter. To the outside world, their life was flawless. Mike adored Denise. He worked tirelessly to provide for her, often leaving the house before dawn and returning after dark, driven by a desire to give his wife and child the best life possible. But Mike also had a passion, an escape from the pressures of work and the demands of maintaining a perfect image. He loved to hunt. Specifically, he loved duck hunting. There was something about the solitude of the lake in the early morning, before the sun rose, that gave him peace. He loved the ritual of it, the loading of the boat, the setting of the decoys, the quiet waiting in the cold mist. On the morning of December 16th, 2000, Mike woke up long before the rest of the world. It was a special day. It was his 6th wedding anniversary with Denise. They had plans to celebrate that evening. They were going to fly out to Apalachicola for a romantic dinner. But Mike wanted to squeeze in a few hours of hunting first. It was the peak of the season. He kissed his wife goodbye, patted his sleeping daughter, and hooked his small boat to his Ford Bronco. He drove out into the darkness, heading west toward Lake Seminole. He stopped at a gas station to buy fuel and a biscuit. The cashier remembered him. He was polite as always. He drove to the boat landing, a desolate patch of gravel surrounded by towering pines. He launched his boat into the freezing black water, and then Mike Williams motored away from the shore, the sound of his engine fading into the heavy fog that blanketed the lake. He was never seen alive again. When noon arrived, Mike had not returned. This was uncharacteristic. Mike was a man of schedules. He was never late. Denise called her father worried. She called Mike's best friend, a man named Brian Winchester. Brian was a large, imposing figure, and like Mike, he was a deeply religious man and an avid hunter. In fact, Brian and his wife were best friends with Mike and Denise. The two couples did everything together. They went to dinners. They went on vacations. They attended the same Bible studies. Brian worked in insurance, and he was the one who had helped Mike write a substantial life insurance policy just months earlier. A policy worth nearly $2 million, intended to protect Denise and the baby if anything ever happened. Brian Winchester told Denise not to worry, but he agreed to go look for Mike. He drove out to Lake Seminole with Mike's father-in-law. What they found at the boat landing sent a shiver of dread through the entire community. Mike's Ford Bronco was parked there alone. The trailer was empty. The boat was gone. A massive search was launched. The Sheriff's Department, the Wildlife Commission, and dozens of volunteers descended on the lake. Helicopters swept low over the sawgrass, their rotors whipping the water into a frenzy. Divers braved the murky depths, feeling their way through the submerged timber and the thick mud. They searched for hours, which turned into days. Then they found the boat. It was drifting aimlessly in a cove, hidden by the tall grass. But the boat was not flipped over. It was upright. Inside, the scene was confusing. Mike's shotgun was there. His decoys were there. His vehicle keys were there. But Mike was gone. The theory that emerged from the authorities was terrifying in its simplicity. They speculated that Mike had stood up in the boat to relieve himself or to fix a decoy. He had lost his balance, wearing heavy waders, waterproof overalls used by hunters. If waders fill with water, they act like an anchor, dragging a man down to the bottom in seconds. They believed Mike had fallen in, drowned, and sunk into the mud. But days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, and no body was ever found. In the waters of Florida, bodies usually surface. The gases of decomposition bring them up. But Mike stayed down. And so, a darker whisper began to circulate among the locals. The alligators. Lake Seminole was infested with them. The authorities suggested a gruesome conclusion. Mike Williams had drowned, and before his body could float, he had been consumed, eaten, erased from existence by the prehistoric predators of the lake. It was a horrific thought, a nightmare scenario that made the front page of the newspapers. Consumed by alligators. It was the only explanation that made sense of the empty lake. Denise Williams, the grieving widow, accepted this conclusion with a stoicism that some found admirable and others found unsettling. She played the part of the heartbroken wife. She held a memorial service. She wept, but she also moved on with a speed that raised eyebrows. Within days of the disappearance, she applied for the insurance money, $1.75 million. It was a fortune in North Florida in the year 2000, and she wasn't alone in her grief. Brian Winchester, the best friend, was there by her side. He comforted her. He helped her with the paperwork. He helped her manage the estate. But there was one person who refused to accept the alligator theory. One person who stood like a stone wall against the tide of acceptance. That was Cheryl Williams, Mike's mother. A mother knows her son, and Cheryl knew Mike. She knew he was an expert swimmer. She knew he was careful. But more than that, she did her research. She talked to alligator experts, biologists, and seasoned hunters. They all told her the same thing. Alligators do not eat in the winter. In December, the water temperature drops, and the reptile's metabolism slows down. They go dormant. They don't hunt. And even if they did, they don't eat an entire human being without leaving a trace. No boots, no jacket, no shreds of clothing. It was biologically impossible. Cheryl began a crusade that would last for 17 years. She became the town's conscience, a thorn in the side of the police and the widow. She spent her life, savings, printing posters. She rented massive billboards on the side of the highway with Mike's face and the words, "Missing, not eaten by alligators." She stood on street corners in the rain, handing out flyers. She wrote letters to the governor, to the FBI, to anyone who would listen. She was dismissed as a crazy woman, a mother who couldn't let go. People crossed the street to avoid her. Denise, her own daughter-in-law, cut her off completely. Denise told Cheryl that if she didn't stop looking for Mike, she would never see her granddaughter again. Cheryl had to make a heartbreaking choice: stop fighting for her son, or lose her grandchild. She chose her son. She never stopped. While Cheryl stood in the rain holding her signs, life inside the subdivision moved on, and the picture of the perfect grieving widow began to shift. 5 years after Mike vanished, the rumors that had been whispered in the grocery stores and church pews became reality. Denise Williams married Brian Winchester, the best friend, the man who sold the insurance policy, the man who found the empty boat trailer. They bought a massive house together. They combined their families. They lived on the money that came from Mike's death. To the outside observer, it looked like a Shakespearean tragedy turned into a dark romance. Two grieving souls finding comfort in each other's arms. But to Cheryl, and to the detectives who had quietly kept the file open, it looked like something else entirely. It looked like the motive. Years bled into decades. The case went ice cold. The files gathered dust in the basement of the sheriff's office. Mike Williams was declared legally dead. The alligator theory became the official history. Denise and Brian lived their life of luxury. They went on vacations. They raised their children. They walked through the world with the confidence of people who had gotten away with the perfect crime. But evil rarely holds together forever. The pressure of a shared secret acts like water freezing in a crack in the rock. It expands, it pushes, and eventually it shatters the stone. By 2016, the marriage between Denise and Brian Winchester had begun to crumble. The passion that had been fueled by their illicit secret had turned into paranoia and control. They separated. They filed for divorce. But Brian was not willing to let Denise go. He knew too much. He had done too much. He began to spiral. In a desperate attempt to keep control over her, Brian Winchester made a fatal mistake. A mistake that would blow the lid off the 17-year-old mystery. On a humid morning in August 2016, Denise Williams got into her car to drive to work. But she wasn't alone. Brian had broken into her car. He was hiding in the back seat with a gun. When she started the engine, he rose up like a ghost. He put the gun to her ribs. He forced her to drive to a remote area. He was terrified that she was going to go to the police, that she was turning on him. He screamed at her. He threatened suicide. He threatened her. But Denise, maintaining her ice-cold composure, managed to talk him down. She promised him she wouldn't tell. She convinced him to let her go. But the moment she was free, she drove straight to the police station. Brian Winchester was arrested for kidnapping and aggravated assault. He was facing 20 years in prison. For the first time in his life, the big, confident insurance man was backed into a corner. He sat in a cold interrogation room, looking at the prospect of spending the rest of his life behind bars. He knew Denise. He knew she would never help him. She would let him rot to protect herself. And so, Brian Winchester decided to play the only card he had left, the ace of spades. The secret that lay at the bottom of Lake Seminole. He called the investigators and offered them a deal. He would tell them everything. He would tell them what happened to Mike Williams. He would tell them where the body was. In exchange, he wanted immunity for the murder. He would go to prison for the kidnapping, but he didn't want the death penalty for Mike. The state attorney had a difficult choice. To let a murderer avoid a life sentence for murder was a bitter pill. But without Brian, they had nothing. No body, no weapon, no proof. Just a mother with a billboard. They made the deal. On a crisp autumn day in 2017, a convoy of police vehicles drove out to a remote, swampy area near Carr Lake, miles away from where Mike's boat had been found. Brian Winchester, in handcuffs and leg irons, led them to a nondescript patch of mud and shoreline weeds. Here, he said, the excavators began to dig. They peeled back the layers of earth, 17 years of leaves and soil. And there, preserved in the thick, anaerobic mud, they found him. They found Mike Williams. He was wearing his wedding ring. He was wearing his heavy winter jacket. He had not been eaten by alligators. He had been buried by his best friend. In a recorded confession that played out like a noir film script, Brian Winchester laid out the entire horrific plot. He and Denise had started an affair years before Mike died. They were obsessed with each other. They wanted to be together, but they didn't want a divorce. Denise, concerned with her image and her standing in the church, didn't want the stigma of a failed marriage. And more importantly, she didn't want to split the assets. She didn't want to be a struggling single mother. She wanted the money. She wanted the $2 million. So they hatched a plan. The plan was cold and brutal. They decided that Mike had to die in an accident. Brian admitted that on that cold December morning, he had met Mike at the lake. He had launched his own boat and motored out to meet Mike in the deep water. The plan was simple. Brian would push Mike overboard. Mike weighted down by the waiters, would drown. It would look like a tragic fall. Brian pulled his boat alongside Mike's. They talked, and then Brian shoved him. Mike fell into the freezing black water. He splashed. He struggled. But Mike Williams was strong. He didn't sink. He managed to strip off his waders underwater. He swam to a submerged tree stump and clung to it. He pulled himself up, gasping for air, shivering, looking at his best friend with confusion and fear. "Help me, Brian," he surely thought. But Brian didn't offer a hand. He realized the drowning plan had failed. He picked up his shotgun. He circled the boat, and as Mike clung to the stump, begging for his life, Brian Winchester raised the gun and fired. A single shot to the face. The sound rolled across the empty lake, absorbed by the fog. Brian then dragged Mike's body into his boat. He drove back to his truck. He loaded his dead best friend into the back, covered him with a tarp, and drove to Walmart to buy a shovel. He then drove to the remote spot at Carr Lake and dug a hole in the mud. He buried Mike, and then he went home to comfort the widow. The trial of Denise Williams was a spectacle of justice. She sat in the courtroom, stone-faced, as Brian took the stand against her. He detailed how she had masterminded the plot, how she had manipulated him, how she had come up with the alibis. He described how they had slept soundly for 17 years, while Mike lay in the mud. The defense tried to paint Brian as a liar, a man trying to save his own skin. They claimed Denise knew nothing, that she was a victim too. But the jury looked at the insurance policies. They looked at the marriage. They looked at the cold, hard logic of the timeline. And they looked at Cheryl Williams, the mother who had aged 20 years in the pursuit of truth, sitting in the front row clutching a picture of her son. It took the jury only a few hours to reach a verdict. Guilty. Guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. Guilty of accessory after the fact. Guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced Denise Williams to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, the mask of perfection finally shattered, leaving behind a legacy of greed and a mother's undying love. The lake is quiet now. The alligators still drift through the tea-colored water, innocent of the crimes attributed to them. The billboards are gone, but the legend of Mike Williams remains. It is a story whispered in the duck blinds and the fishing boats, a warning that the most dangerous predators in the wild are not the ones with scales and teeth, but the ones with wedding rings and friendly smiles, waiting in the fog for the perfect moment to strike. The river was a dark, oily vein cutting through the heart of the city. In the 1930s, the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, Ohio, did not look like water. It looked like sludge, thick with the waste of Standard Oil, steel mills, and paint factories. It was a river that would famously catch fire, but in the depths of the Great Depression, it was simply a graveyard for the city's refuse. And on the banks of this poisoned river, in a desolate, trash-strewn ravine known as Kingsbury Run, a different kind of darkness was taking shape. This is not just a story about a killer. It is a story about a time and a place where the American dream had curdled into a nightmare of poverty and desperation. It is the story of the one man who thought he could save the world, and the phantom who proved him wrong. To understand the terror that gripped Cleveland from 1935 to 1938, you have to close your eyes and imagine the grayscale of the era. The colors of the world had been washed out by economic collapse. Cleveland was the sixth largest city in America, a titan of industry that had been brought to its knees. The steel mills were operating at a fraction of their capacity. The soup line stretched for blocks, filled with men in worn-out coats and fedoras, men who had once been fathers and providers. now reduced to ghosts haunting the sidewalks. And nowhere was this despair more concentrated than in Kingsbury Run. It was a jagged scar in the landscape, a dry riverbed that wound its way from the suburbs down to the industrial flats. It was a no man's land, a place where the forgotten men of the Depression built their homes out of scrap wood, cardboard, and rusted sheet metal. They called them shantytowns, or Hoovervilles. In the Run, the smoke from barrel fires hung low in the valley, mixing with the fog off the lake to create a perpetual twilight. The only soundtrack was the constant, rhythmic clatter of the freight trains passing overhead on the nickel plate railroad, slowing down just enough for the hobos to jump on or jump off. It was a transient world, a place where you could arrive in the morning and be gone by nightfall, and no one would know your name. And it was here, in this transient, broken world, that the Mad Butcher found his hunting ground. The horror began slowly, almost imperceptibly, like a leak in a dam. On a humid afternoon in September 1935, two teenage boys were playing at the base of a hill in the Run, an area locally known as Jackass Hill. The boys spotted something pale in the weeds. At first, in the dim light, they thought it was a mannequin, perhaps discarded from a department store window. But as they drew closer, the buzzing of the flies told a different story. It was a body, a white male, naked, drained of blood. But the horror was in the details. The man had been decapitated, the head was missing, and the body had been cleaned. It was not a messy crime scene. The skin was scrubbed pink, as if the killer had tried to wash away the sins of the act. The man's wrist showed signs of rope burns, indicating he had been bound. Nearby, the police found a second body. This one was older, more decomposed. It had been treated with a chemical preservative, which turned the skin a reddish, leathery color. The coroner would later determine that this body had been dead for weeks, maybe months. Two victims, one fresh, one preserved, both headless, both cast aside like the garbage that littered the ravine. The police were baffled. They identified the fresh body as Edward Andersey, a young drifter with a history of petty crime and a reputation for frequenting the unsavory gay bars of the roaring 3rd District. The second body, the preserved one, was never identified. He became the first of the unknown, the Lady of the Lake. Though he was a man. At the time, Cleveland had a new safety director. His name was Elliot Ness. Yes, that Elliot Ness. The man who had led the Untouchables. The man who had brought down Al Capone in Chicago. Ness had arrived in Cleveland with a mandate to clean up the city. He was young, handsome, and impeccably dressed. He was a celebrity lawman, the rock star of his day. He believed in logic, in order, in the power of the law. He looked at the corruption in the police force and the mobsters running the gambling dens, and he saw problems he could solve. But when he looked down into the muddy abyss of Kingsbury Run, Elliot Ness stared into the face of a chaos. He was not equipped to fight. Capone had been a businessman, a violent one, but a businessman with motives of money and power. The butcher of Kingsbury Run had no motive that a sane mind could understand. The winter of 1935 was harsh. The wind whipped off Lake Erie, freezing the shantytowns. The murders seemed to stop, or perhaps the snow just hid the evidence. But as the thaw came in 1936, the nightmare returned. In January, half of a woman's body was found wrapped in newspaper and stuffed into 2-bushel baskets, left near a factory building. She was never identified. They called her the Floater. Then in June, 2 young boys found the head of a man wrapped in his own trousers near the East 55th Street Bridge. The next day, the police found the body dumped miles away, in front of the Nickel Plate Railroad police station. It was a taunt. a direct message to the authorities. This victim was tattooed with 6 distinct tattoos, including the names Helen and Paul, and a Jigs cartoon character. They printed sketches of the tattoos in newspapers across the country. Thousands of people viewed the body, but no one claimed him. He was just another lost soul, known only as the Tattooed Man. By now, fear had mutated into panic. The newspapers, which had initially buried the stories in the back pages, now splashed the Mad Butcher across the headlines. People stopped walking alone at night. The residents of the shanty towns, usually wary of the police, began to sleep in shifts, watching the shadows. The killer was evolving. He was becoming more brazen. The bodies were always the same, decapitated, often dismembered, drained of blood, and washed clean. The precision of the cuts was terrifying. This wasn't the work of a frenzied maniac hacking away in the dark. The coroner, Dr. Samuel Gerber, noted that the disarticulations were clean. The killer knew anatomy. He knew exactly where the joints were. He severed heads with a single, confident stroke. Gerber told Ness, "You are looking for a doctor, or a butcher, someone who knows how to take a body apart." Elliot Ness was under immense pressure. His reputation was on the line. He poured resources into the investigation. He raided the shantytowns, rounding up hundreds of vagrants, hoping to flush out the killer. He set up secret surveillance posts. He interrogated sexual deviants, disgraced surgeons, and violent drifters. But the killer was a ghost. He left no fingerprints. He left no witnesses. He operated in a world of transients, preying on people who wouldn't be missed until it was too late. In July 1936, a hiker found a decapitated head in the woods. The body was found the next day. This time, the victim was identified. It was Rose Wallace. She was the only victim to be positively identified besides Edward Andersey and the Tattooed Man, who was only identified years later through modern research. Rose was a local woman who had disappeared 10 months earlier. The fact that she had been dead for so long meant the killer was keeping the body somewhere. He had a lair, a place where he could take his time, a place with water to wash them, and tools to dismantle them. The city held its breath as 1937 arrived. The depression dragged on, and the body count rose. A Jane Doe found on the lakeshore, a John Doe found in the flats, the torso of a woman found floating in the Cuyahoga River. Her lower half never recovered. The brutality was escalating. The killer began to remove the hearts of some victims. He was taking trophies. And Elliot Ness, the man who could not be bought, the man who could not be intimidated, was beginning to fray. He started drinking more heavily. The press, once his greatest ally, began to turn on him. They called him ineffective. They mocked his fancy suits and his inability to catch a phantom. The investigation took a strange, psychological turn. Ness and Coroner Gerber began to build a profile. They believed the killer was a man of size and strength to carry the bodies. He likely had a car. He was intelligent, and most disturbingly, he likely lived among them. He wasn't a hobo. He was someone who could move between the world of the light and the world of the dark. In 1938, the killer made his boldest move yet. A woman's torso was found wrapped in a blue blazer, dumped in a gully. The blazer was traced to a local church group, but it led nowhere. Then, days later, investigators found the body of a man. But this wasn't just dumped in the weeds. The killer had propped the body up against a fence, facing the window of the editor of the Cleveland Plain Dealer newspaper. It was a grim tableau, a middle finger to the press and the police. "I am here," it seemed to say, "and you cannot see me." This was the breaking point for Elliot Ness. On August 18, 1938, Shortly after midnight, Ness did something desperate. He assembled a small army of police officers, firemen, and bulldozers. He descended into Kingsbury Run. It was a raid of biblical proportions. The police moved through the shantytown, evicting the hobos, searching the shacks. And then, Ness gave the order, burn it down. The night sky over Cleveland glowed orange as the shantytown was consumed by flames. The wooden crates, the cardboard shelters, the meager possessions of the forgotten men, all of it went up in smoke. Ness claimed he was destroying the killer's playground, removing the fingerprints of the crime scene. But to the public, it looked like an act of frustration. It was the act of a man trying to burn away a problem he couldn't solve. The raid was controversial. It was criticized as cruel. But strangely, after the fires of Kingsbury Run died down, the official murders stopped. But the story does not end there, because Elliot Ness found his suspect. His name was Dr. Francis Sweeney. Sweeney was everything the profile suggested. He was a doctor, a skilled surgeon who had served in World War I in a medical unit that performed amputations in the field. He was a large man. He was an alcoholic, and he was mentally unstable. He had a history of violent outbursts. But Dr. Francis Sweeney had one other attribute that made him untouchable. He was the first cousin of Congressman Martin L. Sweeney, one of Elliot Ness's fiercest political rivals and a powerful critic of the administration. The interrogation of Francis Sweeney is the stuff of noir legend. It did not happen in a police station. Ness couldn't risk the press finding out he was questioning the congressman's cousin without hard proof. Instead, Ness rented a suite at the downtown Cleveland Hotel, room 401. For 2 weeks, Ness and his men held Sweeney in that room. It was a psychological duel. Ness, the exhausted lawman, and Sweeney, the smiling, arrogant doctor. They brought in Leonard Keeler, the man who invented the polygraph machine. At the time, the polygraph was cutting-edge technology. They hooked Sweeney up to the wires. The needle scratched against the paper. Ness asked the questions. Did you kill Edward Andersey? The needle jumped. Did you decapitate the tattooed man? The needle jumped wildly. Keeler told Ness, "That's your man. I've never seen a more deceptive graph in my life." But Sweeney just smiled. He knew who his cousin was. He knew Ness couldn't touch him without a confession or physical evidence. And Ness had neither. Sweeney was too smart. He had cleaned his crime scenes too well. The confrontation ended in a stalemate. Ness had to let him go. There was no arrest, no trial. The most famous lawman in America had the monster in a hotel room, and he had to open the door and let him walk out. It broke Ness. He continued to receive taunting postcards for years, postmarked from wherever Sweeney was living. They were cryptic, mocking messages, often referencing the murders. Sweeney eventually checked himself into a veterans hospital, where he lived out the rest of his days, dying in obscurity in the 1960s. The postcards stopped only when Ness died. The Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run was never officially caught. The case remains open to this day, but the legacy of those years still hangs over Cleveland. If you go down to the flats today, the landscape has changed. The shantytowns are gone, replaced by highways and warehouses. The Cuyahoga River has been cleaned up. It flows clearer now. But the train tracks are still there. The nickel plate line still runs through the gully. And on quiet nights, when the fog rolls off Lake Erie and settles into the low ground, you can still feel the heaviness of the air. You can hear the whistle of the freight trains echoing off the concrete bridges. It is a lonely sound, a sound that reminds you that there are corners of this country where people can slip through the cracks. The victims of the torso killer were the discarded people of their time. The working poor, the drifters, the immigrants looking for a better life. They came to the city of industry hoping for a job, a warm meal, a chance. Instead, they met a monster who saw them not as human beings, but as raw material. Their names, largely, are lost to history. The Lady of the Lake, the Floater, the Tattooed Man. They are buried in potter's fields, in unmarked graves. But the mystery keeps them alive. It keeps us wondering about the man who could surgically disassemble a human being and then vanish into the smoke of the burning river. As you lay in the dark tonight, listening to the hum of your own city, remember the story of Kingsbury Run. Remember that the line between civilization and chaos is thinner than we think. It is as thin as a sheet of cardboard in a shantytown. It is as fragile as the reputation of a hero. The rain has stopped now in our story. The fires of the shantytown have burned down to embers. The police cars have driven away, and the ravine is silent once more. Dr. Sweeney is in his hospital room, laughing at a joke only he understands. Elliot Ness is pouring another drink, staring at a map on his wall, wondering where he went wrong. And the wind blows through the empty space where the shacks used to be, whispering the secrets that the river will never tell. The year was 1968. It was a turbulent time in America. The country was shifting, uneasy, caught between the nostalgia of the past and the uncertainty of the future. But in the quiet corners of the South, far away from the protests and the noise of the cities, the world still moved at a slower pace. The nights were darker, the woods were deeper, and the silence was absolute. Our story begins in the stillness of a December night in Decatur, Georgia. It is a few days before Christmas. The air is cold and damp, the kind of chill that seeps into the bones. At the Roadway Inn, a modest motel on the outskirts of town, the neon sign buzzes softly against the darkness, casting a red glow onto the wet pavement. Inside room 137, 20-year-old Barbara Mackle is resting. Barbara is a young woman of privilege, the daughter of a wealthy Florida land developer, Robert Mackle. She is intelligent, kind, and widely loved. But on this night, she is vulnerable. A severe wave of the Hong Kong flu had been sweeping across the country that winter, and Barbara had fallen ill at college. Her mother, Jane, had driven up to care for her, and they had stopped at the motel to rest before making the long drive home for the holidays. The room is warm. The curtains are drawn. It is a sanctuary of safety in a sick world. Barbara is sleeping, weak from the fever. Her mother is reading by a dim lamp. It is the definition of ordinary. It is the kind of quiet night that happens a million times over across the highways of America. But outside, in the shadows of the parking lot, a car is idling. Inside the car sits a man named Gary Christ. He is not an ordinary criminal. He is an intellectual, a man who sees himself as a genius, a man who treats crime not as an act of passion, but as an engineering project. Beside him is a young accomplice. They are watching room 137. They are not waiting for a moment of chaos. They are waiting for the silence to settle. They have been planning this night for months. They have built something in the woods. Something terrible. Something designed to hold a human life in a suspended state of waiting. At around 4 a.m., the silence of the motel room is broken by a knock at the door. It is a firm, authoritative knock. Jane Mackle wakes up. She approaches the door. A voice from the other side identifies himself as a police officer. He says there's been an accident involving a white Ford, a car similar to Barbara's, and he needs to speak with them. It is a ruse, simple but effective. In 1968, you open the door for the police. Jane unlocks the latch. The door swings open, and the nightmare steps inside. Gary Christ is wearing a police cap and holding a shotgun. He is calm. He is polite. He tells them not to scream. He moves with the precision of a machine. He unplugs the phone. He binds Jane Mackle's hands and feet. He tells Barbara, who is groggy and feverish, to get out of bed. He tells her she is coming with him. There is no screaming. There is no frantic struggle. The terror is in the quiet compliance. Barbara, dressed only in her nightgown and a coat, steps out into the freezing night air. She looks back at her mother one last time. She is led to the waiting car. The door closes. The engine revs. And just like that, Barbara Mackle vanishes from the world of the living. They drive for what feels like an eternity. The neon lights of the city fade away, replaced by the crushing blackness of the Georgia pines. The car winds through back roads, deeper and deeper into the forest, into a place where no one goes. A place where the trees grow so thick they block out the moon. Eventually, the car stops. It is pitch black. Gary Christ leads Barbara into the woods. The ground is soft with pine needles and wet earth. They walk until they reach a clearing, and there Barbara sees it. It is a hole in the ground, a freshly dug grave. But this is not an execution. Christ explains the plan to her with a chilling detachment. He tells her she is being ransomed for $500,000. He tells her that her father will pay. But until he does, she must be hidden where no one will find her. He points to the hole. Inside there is a box. It is a coffin-like structure, but larger. It is an engineering marvel of madness. Christ has built it out of reinforced plywood. He has painted it green to blend in with the earth. He has waterproofed it with fiberglass. He has drilled holes for air tubes. He has installed a small battery-operated fan. He has stocked it with water, food, a blanket, and a small light. He has created a capsule for survival, buried 3 feet underground. He tells Barbara to climb in. Imagine that moment. The woods are silent. The cold wind is biting at her skin. She is sick, weak, and terrified. She looks at the open black box in the ground. She looks at the man with the gun. She has a choice. Die here, or climb into the earth and pray. Barbara Mackle is a woman of immense hidden strength. She does not panic. She does not beg. She climbs into the box. She lies down on the floor of the capsule. Christ hands her the supplies. He checks the air hoses. He is meticulous. He is proud of his work. And then he begins to close the lid. The darkness descends. Then comes the sound of the screws being driven in, one by one, sealing her in. Then, the sound that is terrifying beyond words. The sound of the first shovel of dirt hitting the plywood roof. Thud, thud, thud. The sound gets duller and duller as the earth piles up. The weight of the world is literally being placed on top of her. And then silence. Barbara Mackle is now alone. She is buried alive in the Georgia woods. Above her, there's 3 feet of soil. Above that, the forest floor. Above that, the winter sky. She is in a space no larger than a refrigerator. She turns on the small light. She listens to the hum of the small fan, pushing fresh air down the plastic tubes. This fan is her lifeline. If the batteries die, the air stops. She checks her watch. She decides that she will not die here. She decides that she will wait. She sings Christmas carols to herself to keep track of time. She thinks of her family. She eats the sugar cookies Christ left her. She conserves her energy. In the absolute sensory deprivation of the box, time begins to warp. Seconds stretch into minutes, minutes into hours. But Barbara holds on to her sanity with an iron grip. She trusts her father. She knows he is coming. Meanwhile, on the surface, a desperate, High-stakes game of chess is beginning. Jane Mackle manages to free herself at the motel and calls the police. The news reaches Robert Mackle in Florida. He is devastated, but he is a man of action. He flies to Atlanta immediately. The FBI enters the case. Edgar Hoover himself is briefed. This is the first kidnapping of its kind, a live burial. The ransom note is chilling. It demands $500,000 in small, used bills. It gives instructions that are complex and rigorous. But there's a problem. The media. The news breaks. Reporters swarm the area. The secrecy that Chris demanded is broken. The first attempt to drop the ransom money fails because a police car accidentally drives by the drop zone, spooking the kidnappers. Panic sets in. Robert Mackle goes on television. He pleads with the kidnappers. He is not angry. He is desperate. "I just want my daughter back," he says. "Please, just take the money." Chris sees the broadcast. He contacts the family again. He sets up a second drop. This time it is in Miami. The instructions are frantic. Robert Mackle has to drive a specific route, alone, with a suitcase full of cash. He has to leave it on a remote dirt road. He does exactly as he is told. He drops the suitcase. He drives away. Chris and his accomplice pick up the money. They have $500,000. They have pulled off the perfect crime. But the FBI is watching. Not close enough to catch them in the act, but close enough to track the general direction. They find the boat Chris used to escape across Biscayne Bay. They find his car. They identify him. The manhunt begins. But while the agents are chasing the money, the clock is ticking in the woods. Barbara has been underground for 2 days, then 3 days. The batteries in the fan are starting to fade. The air is getting stale. The water is running low. The darkness is pressing in. The psychological toll of being buried alive is unimaginable. The feeling of the earth crushing you. The silence that is so loud it rings in your ears. Barbara begins to hallucinate. She imagines she hears people walking above her. She imagines she hears digging. She screams, but the earth swallows the sound. No one can hear her. She is a ghost in a box. But she does not give up. She writes a mental list of all the people she loves. She thinks about the Christmas tree at home. She refuses to let the darkness win. On the surface, the FBI has cornered Gary Christ. He is found hiding in the Florida swamps. He is arrested, but the agents don't care about the money. They don't care about the charges. They ask him one question, over and over again. Where is she? Christ, arrogant to the end, tries to negotiate, but he realizes the game is over. If she dies, he faces the electric chair. If she lives, he has a bargaining chip. He gives them the location. She is near Duluth, Georgia, in the woods, near the abandoned bridge. The call goes out to the FBI field office in Atlanta. It is the morning of December 20th, 83 hours after Barbara was buried. Dozens of agents rush to the forest. They have the general coordinates, but the woods are vast and dense. They spread out in a line, walking through the pine trees. They are looking for anything unnatural, a disturbance in the soil, a tube sticking out of the ground. The tension is unbearable. Every minute that passes is a minute of air lost. One agent spots something, a small, rubber tube poking out of the leaves. It looks like trash, but it is standing upright. He yells out, "Over here!" The agents converge. They fall to their knees. They start digging with their bare hands. They claw at the red Georgia clay. They don't wait for shovels. They dig until their fingers bleed. They hit wood, the hollow thud of plywood. "We found it," someone shouts. They pry the lid open. Imagine the scene. The lid creaks open, and the gray morning light floods into the dark chamber. The agents look down, terrified of what they might find. They expect a body, but they see a movement. A hand raises up to shield eyes that haven't seen light in 3 days. A weak voice whispers, "You are the most beautiful man I have ever seen." Barbara Mackle is alive. She is pulled from the earth, dirty, dehydrated, and weak, but unbroken. She is wrapped in the agents' coats. She is carried out of the woods like a queen. The news travels around the world instantly. The girl in the box has been found. It is a miracle. When she is reunited with her father, the emotion is raw and overwhelming. The man who stood on television and begged for her life now holds her in his arms. The nightmare is over, but the story of Barbara Mackle is not just about the rescue. It is about what happened next. Most people, having survived such a trauma, would retreat from the world. They would be broken by the memory of the dark box. But Barbara Mackle went on to live a full life. She married. She had children. She wrote a book about her experience. She refused to be defined by the box. She defined herself by her survival. Gary Christ was sentenced to life in prison. He was the architect of a nightmare, a man who used his intelligence to create a torture chamber. He eventually got out on parole years later, only to return to a life of crime, proving that while he could build a box, he could never build a soul. Tonight, the woods near Duluth, Georgia, are overgrown. The hole where the box sat has long since filled in with rain and soil. The trees have grown tall, covering the scar on the land. But if you walk there, in the quiet of a December evening, you can still feel the weight of the silence. It is a place that reminds us of two things. It reminds us of the capacity for human cruelty, the mind that could conceive of burying a young woman alive for money. But more importantly, it reminds us of the capacity for human endurance. It reminds us that even when the earth is piled on top of us, even when the darkness is absolute, even when the air is running out, the human spirit can still sing. The darkness could not hold Barbara Mackle, and the earth could not keep her. She waited, she hoped, and she rose. In the quiet, affluent corners of America, there is a specific kind of silence that falls over a town when the snow begins to stick. It is a muffling, heavy silence. It softens the edges of the world, hiding the driveways, covering the manicured lawns, and burying the secrets of the people who live behind the colonial facades. Newtown, Connecticut, is exactly this kind of place. It is a postcard of New England charm, a town of stone walls, steeples, and old money. In 1986, it was a place where people moved to escape the noise and the grit of New York City. It was a place where neighbors waved to one another but kept their distance, respecting the privacy that wealth affords. But in the winter of that year, a darkness descended on Newtown that was colder than the wind blowing off the Atlantic. It was a darkness that would shatter the illusion of the perfect American life and introduce the world to a new kind of horror. One that proved that even in the most beautiful homes, monsters can wear the face of a father, a husband, and a hero. To understand the tragedy of Hellecrafts, you have to understand the illusion she lived in. To the outside world, Helle and her husband, Richard, were the embodiment of success. Richard Crafts was a pilot for Eastern Airlines. He was a man who commanded respect. He flew the massive L-1011 jets, guiding hundreds of passengers through the sky with a steady hand. He was also a part-time police officer in the nearby town of Southbury, a man who wore the badge and carried the gun, a sworn protector of the peace. He was stoic, handsome in a rugged way, and projected an aura of absolute control. Helle, his wife, was the perfect counterpart. She was Danish, with a bright, open face and a kindness that everyone seemed to gravitate toward. She was a flight attendant for Pan Am, a woman who balanced a demanding career with the raising of their 3 young children. They lived in a sprawling ranch-style house on Newfield Lane, nestled among the trees. From the road, with the snow falling gently on the roof, it looked like a sanctuary. But the walls of the house on Newfield Lane held a different reality. By the autumn of 1986, the temperature inside the marriage had dropped to freezing. Richard was not just stoic. He was cold. He was distant, often disappearing for days at a time without explanation. Hella, who had devoted her life to him, began to suspect that his absences were not just about work. She began to see the cracks in the armor. She found receipts. She noted the phone calls that ended abruptly when she walked into the room. And then she found the truth. Richard was seeing another woman. It wasn't just a fling. It was a betrayal that cut to the core of everything Hella believed in. Hella was not a woman to be walked over. She had a spine of steel beneath her gentle exterior. She made a decision. She hired a private investigator, a man named Keith Mayo, to confirm her suspicions. Mayo did his job. He took photos. He documented the affair. And when he handed the evidence to Hella, she didn't crumble. She prepared. She told her friends that she was going to divorce Richard. She told them she was going to take the children and leave. But she also said something else, something that would haunt her friends for decades to come. She told them, "If something happens to me, don't think it was an accident." It was a prophecy whispered over cups of coffee, a fear that she couldn't quite articulate, but felt deep in her bones. She knew Richard. She knew his temper, which simmered under that calm pilot's exterior. She knew that a man who needed to control everything would not react well to losing control of his wife. November 18th, 1986, began like any other Tuesday. A massive storm front was moving toward Connecticut, promising the first real snow of the season. Hella had just returned from a long flight from Frankfurt, Germany. She was tired, but she was happy to be home with her children. She drove the familiar roads to Newtown, the sky turning a bruised purple as the sun set. She arrived home, and the heavy oak door closed behind her. That was the last time Hella Crafts was ever seen alive. The next morning, the snow began to fall. It started as a flurry and quickly turned into a blizzard. The great storm of November 1986 would bury Connecticut under inches of heavy, wet snow. It paralyzed the state. Schools were closed. Roads were impassable. The power lines sagged under the weight of the ice. And in the chaos of the storm, Hella Crafts simply vanished. When her friends called the house the next day, Richard answered. His voice was calm, unbothered. He told them Hella had gone to Denmark to visit her sick mother. It was a plausible story. Hella was devoted to her family. But then, a few days later, the story changed. He told another friend she had gone to the Canary Islands with a friend. He told the nanny she was visiting her sister. He told the police she had just walked out. The lies were sloppy, inconsistent. It was the arrogance of a man who believed he was smarter than everyone else. He believed that no one would question the word of a pilot, a cop, a pillar of the community. But Richard underestimated the women in Hella's life. Flight attendants are trained to notice details. They are trained to communicate. Hella's friends knew her schedule. They knew she would never leave her children without saying goodbye, especially not right before Thanksgiving. They knew her mother wasn't sick. They compared notes. They realized Richard's stories didn't add up, and they did something extraordinary. They refused to be silenced. They went to the police, not just in Newtown, but to the state attorney. They demanded an investigation. At first, the Newtown police were hesitant. Richard Crafts was one of them. He was a brother in blue. They accepted his story that it was a domestic dispute, that she would come back when she cooled off. But the private investigator, Keith Mayo, refused to let it go. He began to dig through the Crafts' trash. He began to watch the house, and he found something disturbing. The master bedroom rug was missing. It was a large, heavy rug. Why would a man throw away a perfectly good rug right after his wife disappeared? As the weeks dragged on, the pressure mounted. The state police took over the investigation, and they brought in a legend of forensic science, Dr. Henry Lee. They obtained a search warrant for the house on Newfield Lane. When they entered, they found a home that was too clean. The bedroom was spotless, but Dr. Lee, with his meticulous eye, noticed a tiny, almost invisible smear on the side of the mattress. It was blood. He found another microscopic spot on the floor. It wasn't much, but it was enough to prove that violence had occurred in that room. But where was Hella? A missing person case without a body is the hardest case to prove. Richard knew this. He had told a friend once, "If you want to commit the perfect murder, you have to get rid of the body. No body, no crime." He seemed confident, almost relaxed. He went about his life, flying his planes, patrolling the streets, playing the grieving husband when he had to, and the abandoned husband when it suited him. But the storm that had hidden his crime would also be his undoing. On the night of the blizzard, around 3:30 a.m., a snowplow driver named Joseph Hine was clearing the roads in Southbury, near the banks of the Housatonic River. It was a desolate stretch of road, pitch black, with the snow swirling in the headlights. As Hine drove his plow, he saw something strange. A woodchipper, a large, industrial-sized woodchipper attached to a truck, parked on the side of the road near the bridge. It was running. Hine thought it was odd. Who would be chipping wood in the middle of a blizzard at 3 in the morning? He saw a man standing next to it, a man silhouetted against the headlights. Hine maneuvered his plow around the truck and continued his work. He didn't think much of it at the time. Weeks later, when the news of Hella's disappearance finally hit the papers, Joseph Hine remembered that night. He remembered the truck. He remembered the woodchipper. He called the detectives. This was the break they had been waiting for. The police focused their search on that specific stretch of the riverbank, an area known as Lake Zor. What they found there was not a body. It was a puzzle, a grotesque, microscopic puzzle scattered among the dead leaves and the melting snow. The investigators got down on their hands and knees. They sifted through the soil, inch by inch. They found wood chips, thousands of them, but mixed in with the wood, they found things that didn't belong. They found strands of blonde hair. They found tiny fragments of bone, no bigger than a fingernail. They found a piece of a finger with pink nail polish. They found a tooth cap. And most damning of all, they found a mail envelope. It was shredded, but the plastic window was intact. And through the plastic, legible even after being put through a machine designed to turn trees into mulch, was the name, Miss Hella Crafts. It was a scene of horror that defied comprehension. Richard Crafts had rented a massive industrial woodchipper. He had frozen his wife's body in a chest freezer, which was also missing from the house, and then, under the cover of the blizzard, he had driven to the river. He had fed her body into the machine, letting the rushing waters of the Housatonic carry away the evidence, believing that the steel blades would reduce her to nothing, erasing her from the earth. The forensic work that followed was unprecedented. Dr. Henry Lee and his team had to prove that these tiny fragments were indeed Hella Crafts. This was before the days of advanced DNA profiling as we know it today. They used tooth comparisons. They matched the nail polish. They matched the hair. They identified the bone fragments as human. They found a chainsaw in the depths of the river, a chainsaw that had been filed down to remove the serial number, but forensic restoration brought the numbers back, tracing it directly to Richard Crafts. The trial was a sensation. It was the first time in the history of the state of Connecticut, and one of the first times in American history, that a murder conviction was sought without a body. The defense argued that Hella was still alive, that she was merely missing, but the prosecution laid out the evidence: the rug, the blood, the lies, the rental receipt for the Woodchipper, and the tiny, heartbreaking remains found by the river. Richard Crafts sat in the courtroom, emotionless. He watched the proceedings with the detached interest of a spectator. He didn't testify. He didn't cry. He didn't show remorse. He maintained the mask of the stoic pilot until the very end. But the jury saw through the mask. They saw the cold calculation of a man who treated his wife not as a human being, but as a problem to be disposed of, like a fallen tree branch. In 1989, Richard Crafts was convicted of murder and sentenced to 50 years in prison. The case became a landmark in forensic science. It proved that you cannot destroy a person completely. The truth has a way of surfacing, even from the bottom of a river, even from the smallest fragment of bone. Today, Newtown is still a quiet, beautiful town. The snow still falls on Newfield Lane, covering the stone walls and the manicured lawns. The house where they lived has changed owners, the memories painted over and renovated. But the story of the Woodchipper murder remains etched in the collective memory of the region. It is a cautionary tale about the secrets that live behind closed doors. It reminds us that the perfect life is often just a facade, a thin layer of ice over a deep, dark river. Hella Crafts was a woman who loved the sky. She spent her life flying, caring for others at 30,000 feet. She deserved to fly away on her own terms, to find the freedom she sought. Instead, she was taken by the person who promised to protect her. But in the end, Richard failed. He tried to make her invisible, but he only succeeded in making her unforgettable. He tried to silence her, but the evidence of her life spoke louder than his machine. As the weeks dragged on, the pressure mounted. The state police took over the investigation, and they brought in a legend of forensic science, Dr. Henry Lee. They obtained a search warrant for the house on Newfield Lane. When they entered, they found a home that was too clean. The bedroom was spotless, but Dr. Lee, with his meticulous eye, noticed a tiny, almost invisible smear on the side of the mattress. It was blood. He found another microscopic spot on the floor. It wasn't much, but it was enough to prove that violence had occurred in that room. But where was Hella? A missing person case without a body is the hardest case to prove. Richard knew this. He had told a friend once, if you want to commit the perfect murder, you have to get rid of the body. No body, no crime. He seemed confident, almost relaxed. He went about his life, flying his planes, patrolling the streets, playing the grieving husband when he had to, and the abandoned husband when it suited him. But the storm that had hidden his crime would also be his undoing. On the night of the blizzard, around 3:30 a.m., a snowplow driver named Joseph Hine was clearing the roads in Southbury, near the banks of the Housatonic River. It was a desolate stretch of road, pitch black, with the snow swirling in the headlights. As Hine drove his plow, he saw something strange. A woodchipper, a large, industrial-sized woodchipper attached to a truck, parked on the side of the road near the bridge. It was running. Hine thought it was odd. Who would be chipping wood in the middle of a blizzard at 3 in the morning? He saw a man standing next to it, a man silhouetted against the headlights. Hine maneuvered his plow around the truck and continued his work. He didn't think much of it at the time. Weeks later, when the news of Hella's disappearance finally hit the papers, Joseph Hine remembered that night. He remembered the truck. He remembered the woodchipper. He called the detectives. This was the break they had been waiting for. The police focused their search on that specific stretch of the riverbank, an area known as Lake Zor. What they found there was not a body. It was a puzzle, a grotesque, microscopic puzzle scattered among the dead leaves and the melting snow. The investigators got down on their hands and knees. They sifted through the soil, inch by inch. They found wood chips, thousands of them, but mixed in with the wood, they found things that didn't belong. They found strands of blonde hair. They found tiny fragments of bone, no bigger than a fingernail. They found a piece of a finger with pink nail polish. They found a tooth cap. And most damning of all, they found a mail envelope. It was shredded, but the plastic window was intact. And through the plastic, legible even after being put through a machine designed to turn trees into mulch, was the name, Miss Hella Lorecrafts. It was a scene of horror that defied comprehension. Richard Crafts had rented a massive industrial woodchipper. He had frozen his wife's body in a chest freezer, which was also missing from the house, and then, under the cover of the blizzard, he had driven to the river. He had fed her body into the machine, letting the rushing waters of the Housatonic carry away the evidence, believing that the steel blades would reduce her to nothing, erasing her from the earth. The forensic work that followed was unprecedented. Dr. Henry Lee and his team had to prove that these tiny fragments were indeed Hellicrafts. This was before the days of advanced DNA profiling as we know it today. They used tooth comparisons. They matched the nail polish. They matched the hair. They identified the bone fragments as human. They found a chainsaw in the depths of the river, a chainsaw that had been filed down to remove the serial number, but forensic restoration brought the numbers back, tracing it directly to Richard Crafts. The trial was a sensation. It was the first time in the history of the state of Connecticut, and one of the first times in American history, that a murder conviction was sought without a body. The defense argued that Hella was still alive, that she was merely missing, but the prosecution laid out the evidence: the rug, the blood, the lies, the rental receipt for the woodchipper, and the tiny, heartbreaking remains found by the river. Richard Kraft sat in the courtroom, emotionless. He watched the proceedings with the detached interest of a spectator. He didn't testify. He didn't cry. He didn't show remorse. He maintained the mask of the stoic pilot until the very end. But the jury saw through the mask. They saw the cold calculation of a man who treated his wife not as a human being, but as a problem to be disposed of, like a fallen tree branch. In 1989, Richard Crafts was convicted of murder and sentenced to 50 years in prison. The case became a landmark in forensic science. It proved that you cannot destroy a person completely. The truth has a way of surfacing, even from the bottom of a river, even from the smallest fragment of bone. Today, Newtown is still a quiet, beautiful town. The snow still falls on Newfield Lane, covering the stone walls and the manicured lawns. The house where they lived has changed owners, the memories painted over and renovated. But the story of the woodchipper murder remains etched in the collective memory of the region. It is a cautionary tale about the secrets that live behind closed doors. It reminds us that the perfect life is often just a facade, a thin layer of ice over a deep, dark river. Hella Crafts was a woman who loved the sky. She spent her life flying, caring for others at 30,000 feet. She deserved to fly away on her own terms, to find the freedom she sought. Instead, she was taken by the person who promised to protect her. But in the end, Richard failed. He tried to make her invisible. but he only succeeded in making her unforgettable. He tried to silence her, but the evidence of her life spoke louder than his machine. At around 4:30 p.m., Maura Murray got into her battered black Saturn. The car was running on 3 cylinders. It smoked. It shook. It was not a car meant for a long-distance road trip in the middle of winter. But Maura didn't care. She turned the key, and the engine sputtered to life. She pulled out of the parking lot and headed north. She didn't tell Billy. She didn't tell her dad. She just drove. Why north? Police later found searches on her computer for the Berkshires and Burlington, Vermont. But she ended up heading toward the White Mountains of New Hampshire, a place she had visited with her family as a child. Perhaps she was seeking the comfort of nostalgia. Perhaps she was running to a memory. The drive would have taken about 2.5 hours. Imagine being in that car with her, the heater blasting to fight the freezing cold outside, the smell of the cheap wine she might have been sipping, the darkness closing in as she left the city lights behind and entered the rural highways, the anxiety in her chest, the weight of the credit card fraud, the car crash, her sister's relapse, all of it sitting in the passenger seat beside her. She drove up Interstate 91, crossing the border into Vermont, and then crossed into New Hampshire. She exited onto Route 112. The road was narrow, winding, and completely unlit. The snowbanks were high. The houses were few and far between. It was just after 7 p.m. The temperature was hovering around freezing. The road curved sharply to the left at a place known as the Weather Barn Corner. It is a notorious curve, a hairpin turn that catches drivers off guard even in the summer. Maura was driving too fast, or perhaps she was distracted, or perhaps the Saturn finally gave up. The car failed to negotiate the turn. It slid across the lane, spun out, and slammed nose first into a snowbank on the wrong side of the road. The impact was hard enough to push the radiator into the fan, cracking the windshield and deploying the airbags. The car came to a rest facing the wrong way, dead in the water, stuck in the snow. For a few minutes, Maura sat there. The silence of the woods rushed back in to fill the void left by the crash. She was alone, but not for long. A school bus driver named Butch Atwood lived just 100 yards down the road. He was returning home from dropping off students after a ski trip. He saw the black Saturn stuck in the snowbank. He pulled his massive bus alongside her. He opened the door and looked down. He saw a young woman, shaken but not visibly bleeding. He asked if she was okay. "I called AAA," Maura told him. Her voice was trembling. "They're on their way." Butch Atwood knew this was a lie. He knew there was no cell phone reception in this part of the White Mountains. It was a dead zone. You couldn't call anyone. He told her that. He said, "I'll go to my house and call the police for you." Maura pleaded with him. "No, please don't call the police." She was terrified. She had been drinking. She had just crashed her dad's car 2 days ago. Another crash involving alcohol would ruin her nursing career, her military record, her life. She just wanted to get the car out and vanish. But Butch Atwood was a good citizen. He told her he had to call. He drove his bus 100 yards to his house, parked, went inside, and dialed 911. It took him several minutes to get through to the dispatcher. This is the most critical window of time in the entire story. It is a window of approximately 7 minutes. From the moment Butch Atwood left Maura's car to the moment the first police cruiser arrived, only 7 to 10 minutes elapsed. 7 minutes. In that time, Maura Murray made a decision. She realized the police were coming. She realized she couldn't get the car out. She opened the trunk. She grabbed her backpack. She grabbed the alcohol. She locked the car doors. And then, she stepped into the night. When Sergeant Cecil Smith of the Haverhill Police Department arrived at 7:46 p.m., he found the Saturn. The hazard lights were flashing, casting an eerie orange glow on the snow. The car was locked. The windshield was cracked. Inside, on the passenger seat, was a box of Franzia wine, damaged from the crash, leaking red liquid that looked like blood in the dim light. There was a splash of red wine on the driver's side door and on the ceiling, suggesting Maura had been holding it when she crashed. But the driver was gone. Smith looked around. He saw no footprints leading into the deep snow of the woods. The snow was crusty and hard. If she had run into the forest, she would have left a trail. The only footprints were on the road, around the car. He went to Butch Atwood's house. "Where's the girl?" Smith asked. "She was just there," Atwood said. "I just left her." But she wasn't there. The search began almost immediately, but it was hampered by the assumption that this was a simple DUI walkaway. The police thought she was hiding in the woods, sobering up, and would come back in the morning for her car. But Maura didn't come back. The next day, her family arrived. Fred Murray looked at the car, and he found something that has baffled sleuths for 20 years. Stuffed into the tailpipe of the Saturn was a white rag. It was a rag from Maura's roadside emergency kit. Why was it there? Fred Murray later said he had told Maura that if her car smoked, she should put a rag in the tailpipe to hide the smoke from the police. But the car had stalled. Had she put it there before the crash? After? Was it a signal? Or was someone else there? Some theories suggest that if you plug a tailpipe, the car will stall. Did someone sabotage her car to make her crash? Or was it just a desperate, confused act of a girl trying to fix a broken machine? The search expanded. They brought and sent dogs. The dogs were given a pair of gloves found in the car. They picked up a scent. They followed it from the car, down the road, about 100 yards east. And then the scent just stopped. It didn't fade away. It stopped abruptly in the middle of the road. To investigators, this meant one thing. Maura didn't walk into the woods. She didn't freeze to death in a snowbank. She got into a vehicle. Whether she got into a car willingly, hitchhiking to safety, or whether she was snatched by a predator who was hunting on that dark road, remains the central question of the mystery. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into years. The snow melted, revealing the thawing earth, but it didn't reveal Maura. The woods of New Hampshire were combed by thousands of volunteers, helicopters, and drones. They found nothing. No backpack, no cell phone, no bottles of alcohol. It was as if she had been abducted by the sky itself. The theories are endless and maddening. There is the tandem driver theory, that Maura was driving north with a friend in another car, and when she crashed, she just jumped into the lead car and they took off. But if so, why hasn't that friend ever come forward? Why leave the car and the identity behind? There is the runaway theory, that Maura wanted to disappear. She packed her room. She withdrew her money. She drove to a place where she could vanish and start a new life. There have been alleged sightings of her in Canada, in Quebec, but Maura was close to her dad. Would she really put him through 20 years of torture just to start over? And then there is the darkest theory, the local dirtbag theory, that Maura was unlucky, that on that lonely stretch of Route 112, a predator was driving by. He saw a vulnerable girl in a crash. He offered her a ride. She, desperate to avoid the police, got in, and he drove her not to a hotel, but to a nightmare. There were rumors of a local A-frame house where strange things happened. Rumors of a concrete floor poured in a basement days after the disappearance. Dogs searched the basement years later and signaled for the scent of human decomposition. But when they dug up the concrete, nothing, just soil. The case of Maura Murray is a labyrinth of clues that lead nowhere. The phone call to her sister, the rag in the tailpipe, the red wine on the ceiling, the scent dog stopping in the road. Every clue is a dead end. But the most haunting part of the story is the road itself. If you drive Route 112 today, you will pass the curve. There is a blue ribbon tied to a tree, fraying in the wind. It is a memorial. It is a place where the universe blinked. One moment, a vibrant, troubled, complex young woman was standing in the snow, breathing the cold air, making a decision. 7 minutes later, she was gone. The tragedy of Maura Murray is not just that she died, if she died. It is that she vanished in the middle of a sentence. She was in the middle of fixing her life, or running from it. She was in transition, and she remains in transition, suspended forever in the cold February night of 2004. Her father, Fred, still searches. He is an old man now. He spends his weekends in those woods, poking at the dirt with a stick, looking for a bone, a zipper, a piece of the past. He refuses to let the silence win. He refuses to let the snow cover his daughter forever. We often think of disappearances as something that happens in remote, exotic places. But Maura disappeared on a paved road, next to houses, with a school bus driver watching. She disappeared in the gap between safety and danger, the gap between the headlights and the dark. It is a reminder that we are all just traveling on a dark road. We think we know where we are going. We think we are in control of the machine. But all it takes is a patch of ice, a sharp curve, and a few minutes of bad luck for the world we know to dissolve into shadow. Tonight, the wind is still blowing through the Wild Ammonoosuc Valley. The trees are still watching, and somewhere, perhaps in the deep woods, or perhaps in a memory, Maura Murray is still waiting to be found. Until then, she is the ghost in the headlights, the warning on the map, the girl who drove into the winter and never came back. Sleep well, and keep your doors locked.